Episode 55, Interview with Ryan Littlefield. Welcome to the Visionary Variety Podcast, where we cover cool stuff like photo, video, film, books, and technology. So switch on your brain and enjoy the show. Welcome back to the podcast, guys. I hope you enjoyed last week's solo episode with Nate. I was sick. My whole household was sick, so I couldn't get on the show. So Nate took it from there, and it was a great episode. So this week, we're going to be interviewing my new friend, Ryan Littlefield. He's a really talented guy. Currently, he's a photographer, but in his previous career, he was a visual effects artist, and he worked on Hollywood movies with big actors and big names attached to them. So you don't want to miss this episode. We're going to be taking a peek behind the curtain of how special effects are done in Hollywood movies, because Ryan has done a lot of really impressive scenes, and I think it's going to be a really great episode, especially if you like movies, 3D stuff, special effects. It's going to be a good one. Let's just get started off with where you're from and what you do currently.
Okay, I'm born and raised here in San Antonio, Texas. I'm currently a professional photographer, handle anything from weddings to corporate events.
You like the variety, right?
Oh yeah, anything I can get my hands on. I don't think anybody's afraid of money. So if people are willing to pay you to do it, I think we're all on the same page in that story. But I was a visual effects artist for Millennium Films in Shreveport, Louisiana for about 4 years. Then when that kind of slowed down, I moved back to San Antonio, kind of started developing and building a family. Had some elderly people in my family who their health was kind of going downhill, so I picked up photography to stay local and just help out with the family and do the best that I can.
Gotcha. Now, for the listeners who are maybe at a computer or on their phone right now, where can they find your current photography work?
The easiest way to do it is just Google. You can search Ryan L. Imagery, and it'll bring up links to my Facebook page, my Instagram, my website. It's all registered under the same name, Ryan L. Imagery.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, you've got some great work, and I always look forward to seeing your posts. You're definitely a multi-talented guy.
Well, I appreciate it and put a lot of effort into it.
I understand that. Okay, so Ryan, what exactly is a visual effects artist, and what do they do?
The best way I like to describe that is taking it back to the days before I was an actual visual effects artist and loved watching these movies like Jurassic Park and Toy Story when that came out, these real pivotal movies that had a lot of animation. It comes down to the movie magic, the things that you cannot create and mimic in real life to really sell it on screen and make your viewer feel like you're in there and you're right next to the action. So special effects would be the makeup you apply to people in horror movies where the blood spews out, or you set charges in the ground and you have the explosions as they come running by. But you don't always have that opportunity in the movies, and that's when they bring in the visual effects artists for the green screens, the added smoke, the particle effects, the fake oceans, the dinosaurs roaring, somebody being bitten in half, and that's where the visual effects really comes in. If you can have a visual effects artist do a scene and somebody's sitting there wondering, did somebody set that explosion? Was that wall behind that person really there? And if they're questioning that, then the artist did his job right.
So visual effects is digitally simulated, computer-generated imagery, right?
Correct.
Whereas special effects, or also called practical effects, is real-world things that were done, like miniatures, or like you said, real explosions, animatronics, things like that. That's practical or special effects. And also, maybe if they don't have the budget to do practical effects, they'll hire you. Which, I don't know. Maybe you're more expensive. I'm not sure.
The visual effects is by far more expensive.
Oh, okay. So practical effects is cheaper.
In most cases, from what I understand, visual effects is definitely more expensive. You can go buy, a thing of makeup and have a makeup artist apply something for an hour, and then film a scene that could be a few hours long. But if you need to apply that makeup visually afterwards, in 3 or 4 different scenes, you could be paying somebody for 50, 60, 70 hours of work.
Adding a head wound or blood squirting in post is a whole nother ballgame.
Correct. I have done that, actually. And on Expendables 3, our note was to make Sylvester Stallone appear 20 years younger in every shot.
Oh, good luck with that. Have fun.
It looked all right in the end, but if you take a look at that and Google Stallone and see his real face, you can see a little bit of that movie magic in action.
So you did visual effects artist work for about 4 years. Now you're a successful photographer. Tell me this: does your work as a visual effects artist influence or help your photography right now?
Oh, immensely. Growing up, I always had an interest in arts. I loved, as a little kid, I loved to color just like any other kid. And then I learned to draw. I took art classes in school and did, your basic sculpting and other art forms. After school, kind of got away from it. I just worked regular jobs, tried
Same.
to make money, do what I can here and there, and just kind of lucked out in my opportunity to do visual effects. After doing that for 4 years, learning the composition, the coloring, the white balancing, learning with shadow detail, blacks and white values. When it comes to photography now, basically you just have to learn to tell the camera what your brain is envisioning because you've been trained
hmm
as a visual effects artist to kind of picture your end product beforehand.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, getting the imagination or the vision from your head in onto the camera sensor is the art of photography or cinematography. Making it
Correct.
happen, and that's what will separate someone just that just takes pictures and a real legitimate creator or photographer.
Exactly.
I have a really similar story to you. I also grew up drawing. Every chance I got, I was creating things, building worlds and props and sci-fi stuff. Drawing was a huge part of my childhood, along with Lego, which was another story. I also kind of got, I don't know, tired, or I just didn't challenge myself enough with drawing after high school, and I got away from drawing, but I got into other things. I got into Photoshop and 3D art, or rather, those things that I had already been doing for a few years had really came to the forefront. And I got more into digital art and, of course, photography early in high school. So I kind of transitioned out of drawing, which was my creative outlet at that time, into new creative outlet, which was photography and digital art. But it influences me a lot. Like you just said, the composition, lighting, things like that. It all ties together, and I love that. I love how central all the key elements of art are to all these different outlets like photography, videography, and other things like that. So it's beautifully just tied together by art, which is the foundation of it all.
Oh yeah, you definitely hit the nail on the head there, and like you mentioned, kind of just getting away from it after high school. I mean, it's just only natural. When you get older, you got things to take care of, responsibilities,
hmm
and it's easy to get away from what you used to do at a younger age. But when you mentioned getting into the digital age of art, that's kind of just where it's going.
hmm
Nowadays, some of the best artwork I see that's done by hand, it's not even necessarily with a pen and pencil anymore. It's with a
Yeah.
stylus on a touchpad or something, and even in Photoshop. So still
hmm
just amazing artwork. There's even websites you can get online and look up where they have the Samsung Galaxy Notes with the pen tablet on it, and you'll see
hmm
some absolutely stunning artwork people have created on their phones with that pen tablet, and it's no different than
Oh,
just pen and paper.
you're making me want to buy one now. Don't do
I'm on my
that.
second one, and I don't think I'll ever switch over to a different phone.
I saw a really funny ad where it was basically just stomping all over the iPhone, and it was like all the things that this can do versus what the iPhone can't do.
Exactly. I saw a commercial the other day that mentioned something iPhone has, and my fiance and I were laughing because our Samsungs did it 3 years ago.
Exactly. So back to you being a visual effects artist. What are some of the skills that you used on a day-to-day or a weekly basis in that job?
Well, I'm going to have to go ahead and start off just using the word innovation. Of course, you can apply this to any job at all whatsoever. But when it comes to being a visual effects artist, there's always a base plan anybody has, whether it's for a movie, building a house, no matter what. You got to have your plan, and you got to start with your blueprints. But anywhere along the way, you always encounter a problem, and you always got to find the most cost-effective, quickest way to handle it, and still have it completed in a professional manner. And in visual effects, this is the number one skill you can have. And you don't always have it at the beginning, but as you progress more and more, different movies, more shots, you learn to grow this skill. And it happens very quickly because you encounter a lot of the same problems, but depending on different scenes, different movies, you have to handle it in a different way. So
hmm
innovation becomes something that you learn very quickly to handle.
So there's not much of a formula or a repeating workflow for these kinds of jobs.
Exactly. The end product or the note on the shot may be the same as a different
hmm
one, but the path you have to take to get there is not necessarily A to B to C. Now it could be
hmm
X to Y to Z to get there. So using innovation, what comes along heavily with that is becoming a problem solver. So you have to,
Yeah.
sometimes you may spend 5 or 10 minutes coming up with an idea. Then you have to realize, hey, this is not working. Scrap it. Let's start over. And you can do this 3 or 4 times before you finally find the right path to complete the process. And in order to do this, you definitely have to learn to think outside of the box. It can make you want to beat yourself over the head saying, why doesn't this work now? It worked last time. But you really have to develop, take a step back. Sometimes I would even, just go outside the building and walk around for 10 minutes and come back in and sit down, just try to develop a new way of thinking to solve problems.
That's where I tell my manager, I think best after I take a nap, so I'm just going to take a nap real quick.
Exactly. Well, I remember working on some 3D movies and where you have to wear the glasses in order to see the stereoscopy in there. And sometimes we'd work 15, 16, 7-hour days, and people would put those glasses on and fall asleep right at their desk. One more thing I want to add is I don't know how much of a skill it is, but when you're working on these movies, being able to handle pressure and work under an extremely stressful environment, this is probably the toughest thing to accomplish. Because day one on the job, or even when you're planning the movie, it sounds exciting. You're ready to get in there and get started. But by the end of that movie, or by the end of that, 50, 60 hours working on the same shot,
you're done with it.
Yeah, it can become pretty difficult.
I don't want to see that movie. Did you ever have the situation where a creative director or a manager would come to you and say, all right, guys, we got to have this kind of shot. We want to see a helicopter in the scene, or we got to have a guy chopped in half, make it happen, figure it out. And you're just like, okay. Was that reality for you?
It's kind of funny you bring that up. It was the first few movies I worked on when I was training. My brother actually got me the job there, so I was kind of under his wing for a while. And we had some supervisors who would get their notes from our directors in California, and they would come over, sit at your desk, provide some feedback, maybe show you some examples, give you another artist's work to check out. And, that would kind of help get your feet wet and get you started. But towards the end, before I left Louisiana, my brother had found a job in New Zealand, so he moved off to work on the Hobbit movies. And we got some new, we got a new manager in whose background in film was with animatronics. I believe he animated The Hand and Addams Family. I think he did some work on the Ninja Turtles movies, which is awesome. I love that kind of background. But he became a visual effects supervisor. So if you really needed help, you needed somebody to turn to, you needed some feedback, and if your fellow artist didn't know it, your supervisor pretty much didn't have anything to tell you. So it was very hard when you needed that positive reassurance to say, hey, here you go, this is how we can do it, try this path. And you kind of butted heads quite a bit, all trying to solve the same problem and not really getting anywhere.
Can you give me some specific examples of maybe some solutions that you did find? Like you worked your way through a project and you came out the other end with a good solution. What are some creative solutions you may have come up with?
Okay, so to help accomplish some of the stuff, it really gives you trouble. For example, there's a specific shot that I did on the movie Olympus Has Fallen, and it was with the supervisor I mentioned who didn't have a visual effects background. And at this time, the supervisor below him was the one giving me shots. And we got a note to create a reticle as if you're looking through a rifle scope. And it's the scene where we have people walking out of the front of the White House. They have hoods over their eyes, and they're walking out to this helicopter to take off. So as the camera's panning around to each person one by one, I make this reticle as if it's mimicking a rifle scope.
That's like the crosshairs?
Exactly, the crosshairs.
Okay. That sounds easy. Right?
Sounds pretty easy, right? It'd be pretty easy. You could draw that on a pen and paper and recreate it on a computer pretty easily. So I made a version I thought looked pretty good. The supervisor above me who talked about the shot came over and looked at it and said, great, render it out and we'll show the next supervisor. He comes over, he's playing it back and forth and scrubbing on the arrow keys, looking frame by frame. And, he couldn't really tell you what he didn't like about it, but there's just something he didn't like about it.
So I hate when that happens.
Exactly. We had to do it again. And this is how it works. You do a shot, you work on it, you render it, the head guy looks at it, and if they approve it, you send it off to the director. And they bring back more notes. So this goes on maybe a day and a half. And what started off what I thought would be the easiest shot on the planet was just making me beat myself over the head, create all these different renditions, changing numbers on the reticle here and there, changing the crosshairs. And even the supervisor just above me had loved every single one. We're sitting here thinking, why the heck is this not being approved? So I got this funny idea to where I re-rendered out the very first version of it. And
Here's a new one.
Exactly. And we call him back over and say, hey, what do you think of this one? I bet he looked at it for 30 seconds and goes, oh, great. Let's send it. And it took everything in me just not to start bust out laughing right there on the spot because of all the work I did for him to like the very first version.
Oh, that's great. All right, so we've talked about something specific you've created. What programs did you guys use for these various jobs you did? And what was each of these programs used for?
Okay. Well, when I started off, in the movie Stolen with Nicolas Cage, I believe it went straight to Netflix. I was introduced to the program called Nuke, Nuke, and they have a version called Nuke and Nuke X, and these are just mostly 2D compositing programs. It's not a layer-based system like you would see in After Effects or in Photoshop. These are node-based systems. So basically, your computer screen develops these different nodes you can select that do different tools like you would find in Photoshop. Transform, color correct, saturation here and there.
Yeah, green screen stuff.
Exactly. And so you connect all these with arrows to show kind of like a hierarchy of what's controlling what here and there. And if you don't keep it organized, it really does. When you open up your what they call your composition, it looks like a spider web. And if you have to do some work and pass it off to somebody else who doesn't follow your train of thought in there, they'll be out of luck. So that's where I started. I did that for Stolen. I did that for Texas Chainsaw 3D, and I believe Iceman. And then I started slowly going into the 3D realm. My brother started giving me small 3D projects to do so I can hopefully get some in a movie. And when we did our 3D projects, it was 3D modeling, some basic texturing. We created 3D maps. We did our 3D lighting, 3D rendering in a program called Autodesk Maya. I got to do a little bit of work in some movies with it, but I believe it was the Hercules movie when I started to use ZBrush for texturing. We had to build some of the walls around the city in Hercules, and being able to take textured images and put these 3D walls in ZBrush and use the images over the top of your model and literally sculpt in the detail of the rock and then color it all in ZBrush was pretty fun. It's by far the most fun 3D program I've ever used. And when you find somebody who's more experienced, it's been around 5, 6, 7, even 10 years or so with this, you can see some very photorealistic work that you'd be hard pressed to decide whether it's fake or real.
Yeah, so ZBrush, for those listening that aren't really sure what this is a separate program where you can create two-dimensional textures, but you can also affect 3D objects, right? You can actually make meshes.
Exactly. You can start off with circles, squares, whatever basic object you want, mold it, stretch it, enlarge it, shrink it. And it's as if you were in real life taking a handheld tool and actually sculpting away at it. And it's pretty impressive.
I was watching a video earlier where this guy made an entire, like a small village scene with like a building and a front courtyard. It was a medieval scene. And so in one of the shots, he's using ZBrush and he's painting with like a square brush onto the roof. And he's literally painting in each brick tile for the roof. And so as he paints, it extrudes upwards in a third dimension, and he's like painting on the thickness of the bricks. It was really cool.
Oh yeah, it's amazing. You can extrude it or cut into it, and I use that for so much texturing. Even on my own personal models, the first ones I made, I would throw them in ZBrush, and if I needed to put gunmetal or something on a gun that I made, I would actually turn it on to where you can see the different blacks and whites colors in it, and it would register the blacks and whites as either cutting into it or pulling away at it to extrude and just get photorealistic detail.
Did you ever use Photoshop for any of your texturing?
We didn't use it too much. Mostly what I used Photoshop for there was just to take some of our texture maps. We'd put them in Photoshop, make them black and white really quick and re-export, and then we can now use those as our specular maps for texturing, which would control your shadows and your specular highlights from your lighting and rendering.
We'll get back to the show in just a minute, but first we wanted to give a huge thanks to our special guest this week, Ryan Littlefield. Be sure to follow his work online. He is super talented. You're going to love his work. You can find his accounts on Instagram as Ryan_L_imagery, and his other Instagram account for his boudoir work is boudoir.by.rli. If you're enjoying our podcast, be sure to share this episode on Facebook and help us get the word out. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our podcast in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Lastly, on our Facebook page for the podcast, you can find a link to a poll. This is a questionnaire. We want to hear from you guys about what episodes you like, what episodes you don't like, what do you want to hear more of, all that good stuff. We need to hear back from you guys so that we can improve our podcast this year and make it awesome for you. All right, well, let's get back to the show. So you have worked on legitimate, relatively large budget movies that have either gone to theater or gone to Netflix. They're out there. You guys can watch these. What are some movies you've worked on?
Well, total, I worked on 9. The most recent, with probably the biggest names involved, was Expendables 3. I'm sure we've all seen at least one of these movies with all the big old guys in there.
They're so fun.
And it's kind of funny because I haven't even seen the third one yet, and I worked on it.
Got to get on that.
The largest visual effects budget that I know of that I worked on was Olympus Has Fallen. This budget was, I believe, around $15 million just for the visual effects. And after working on that whole movie, I can begin to understand why. My personal favorite, because I'm such a huge horror movie fan. Ever since I was a little kid, just being afraid of black and white zombies. I've just grown up watching any horror movies that I can. Working on Texas Chainsaw 3D was definitely just like a dream come true. I was like a kid at Christmas every day going to work for that one.
Now, I'm not familiar with this movie. Is this Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
Correct. It's part of the Texas Chainsaw series.
Now, this was shot in like actual 3D, the 2-camera setup?
This one, yes, was shot in what you call stereoscopy. It is 2 cameras. One is straight on, a second camera is slightly angled. So it appears as if the best way you can recreate it is to look at one object, close one eye, and then open your other eye, and you'll see how the object slightly moves left and right. And this kind of simulates what the 2 different cameras are looking at. So when you go to edit this movie for your visual effects work, you're actually doing the same scene, but
twice.
Reworking it twice. Correct. And that can be very, very difficult at times, because if you don't balance everything in the right space, it stands out, it looks weird on screen, and anybody with any experience in this can call it out very quickly, and that's just not good for business.
I have always been curious about 3D filming techniques. If there's a subject moving closer or farther away, and or if you're zooming and your focus is moving, do the cameras are they motorized and they slightly tilt inwards or outwards? Because they've got to adjust their angle, right?
Well, they don't move. You have them set. You pretty much cemented in. From what I understand, you have them cemented in stone, and of course, as your subject gets closer to you, you can probably see more to one side of it than you can as if it was farther away. But that's what tricks your brain into, feeling like you can reach out and touch it, because your eyes can see that edge of it, that different space.
Cool. Well, I've got another question about 3D filming, but we'll get to that later. All right, so Texas Chainsaw 3D, what else have you worked on?
Some of the other ones, Hercules, not the cool one with the rock. I get that question every single time. I wish it was with the rock, but no. Honestly, I can't even remember the guy's name who was the main character in it. I believe he played in one of the Twilight movies. I'm not sure. I did a couple of cool shots in that one. I did Iceman, which when I heard about it, I'm thinking, what? We're getting like a Marvel movie? But no.
Right.
It wasn't as cool as Marvel, but if you learn the history of the movie, it was actually very exciting. It's about a true life serial killer named Richard Kuklinski from Hoboken, New Jersey. When I heard about this, you can actually get on YouTube and listen to his documentaries, his interviews of what happened to him all the way from when he was a kid. And it's extremely interesting. You hear about just how cold-blooded this guy can be, how, I've heard stories growing up, I'm sure many people have, of, the mentally insane, how they can just be extra physically strong and just different otherworldly aspects. And this is pretty much the description of this man. and he managed to maintain, a wife, a family. They loved him. Just complete different character when he started
Wow.
working for the mob and becoming a hitman, and
Oh.
extremely interesting. The movie itself is a small portion of his life, but I would highly
Hmm.
recommend finding the documentary of him too after seeing the movie. Other than Iceman, we did Playing for Keeps with Gerard Butler. Um, I'm not
Okay.
100% sure if this one went to theaters because I saw it when it came out on DVD. Um, it's Gerard Butler as a soccer coach. It's slightly entertaining, kind of a romantic comedy. Not so much my movie, but I'm sure it works for some out there.
What kind of work did you do on that movie?
We did a lot of what they call screen burn-ins, or at least I did. There wasn't too much visual effects, but there were lots of scenes where you had a monitor in the background, which was just filmed with the blue screen. So we have to
Hmm.
insert what they want. I remember there's a scene my brother worked on where there was a Gatorade bottle sitting on top of the soccer goal, and he was trying to display some skills and kick the ball and knock the Gatorade bottle off. So, of course, he's not a professional, didn't really hit the bottle, and my brother had to animate the bottle flying off as if the ball hit it.
That's funny.
And I believe there's another scene where he's at a party and there's a photographer taking pictures. So to simulate the flash going off, I literally grabbed just what we
Uh,
call the grade node and controlled the whites and just basically started it off real small. And within a couple of frames, you have it go almost
douche.
completely white screen and then animate it to fall away really quick and just make that pop here and there. And there was one scene I remember a good friend of mine who has his own YouTube video game channel now. I believe he had to imitate broccoli or asparagus. It was like 3D modeled asparagus or broccoli or something, and he animated, had to track it in on like a server's hand as he's walking by. So nothing exciting, but little things you would absolutely never notice in a movie,
Yeah,
which goes back to my statements earlier about the movie magic. And if you don't notice it, it doesn't
you
seem
did it good.
spectacular, but that means they did a good job.
That rule is true in photography as well. If you're taking great photos, people are just looking and enjoying them. They're not trying to pick apart, oh, how did he do this lighting? Or how did he edit this? They're just looking at a piece of art and enjoying it. That's the goal.
Correct.
That's my goal with my compositing, with my special effects, is like I want them to look at it and think, when is this movie coming out? I want to know, or how did they do this? Did he have a real flamethrower? Like that's the goal. Is a full viewer.
Exactly. That's what I love about using high speed sync so much and capturing those realistic, skies to the eye. Because before high speed sync,
Mhm.
people weren't used to seeing blue skies in photos and having your subject lit well. So you'll turn
Huh.
around the camera
Yeah.
that you light your subject with and shoot high speed sync, and they go, "Oh my God, the background looks photoshopped." And I'm just like, thank you. And you're seeing it
Yeah.
right here. It's on the back of my
Right in your
camera. No,
camera too.
no
Yeah.
Photoshop installed there.
Yeah, I love when people look at the screen on my camera and like, how did you do that? Or I get to tell them I'm not even gonna have to edit this photo, like basically. All right, so what are the movies that you got on your list?
One of the my favorite movies that I've seen that I actually worked on. It wasn't also like for Playing for Keeps. Wasn't a lot of visual effects in it, but this one's called The Big Wedding, and I don't remember if this one went to theaters also. But it stars Robert De Niro. I want to say Susan Sarandon and a few other people that are highly recognizable. I just don't remember their names.
Nice.
And when working on the movies, we don't have the audio. That's what the editors handle downstairs. We just do the visual
Huh.
effects only, render the shot out, and then we send it down to the editors who cut it together how the director wants, and then they add the audio. So I didn't know too much what this movie is about, but Robert De Niro plays a role you're not used to. There's a lot of characters who, at point in times, you're not used to seeing them in their careers as, using vulgar language or just some of the possible, sexual innuendos and jokes. So it just kind of catches you off guard when you see the cast. And it turns out to be actually
Mm.
a really, really funny movie, even though it's kind of like a romantic comedy. Uh, so I loved working on that one. Like I mentioned earlier, the first movie I worked on was Stolen with Nicolas Cage. And
Yeah.
with anybody who's familiar with B movies and Nicolas Cage, there's a lot of a lot of stuff involving him, a lot of funny memes, a lot of short clips here and there, taking his
Poor guy.
various funny faces, his freakouts, and putting them all together. So I became very familiar with this working on Stolen.
I want to do an episode on this podcast just about Nicolas Cage, like I don't know, the greatest stuff or something like that, because He's an interesting guy.
Yeah, that'd be great. Or like a top 10 or top 5,
Yeah.
B movie actors.
Hmm.
You could
Or
definitely be
greatest moments of Nicolas Cage.
exactly.
Interesting side note about Nicolas Cage. He was going to be Superman. I don't remember the year that this movie was supposed to come out, but he had costume tests done. There was a very elaborate, very sci-fi Superman suit made for him. So he was almost Superman, but for some reason the movie didn't go through and it fell apart. But you can find test footage and pictures of them like testing it out.
That's funny. That's funny. I remember there's a similar story. I don't remember who the actor was, but with Big Trouble in Little China, it almost wasn't Kurt Russell. It was somebody else. And
Oh,
John
weird.
Carpenter got Kurt Russell to come in, and I'm glad they did because it worked out
Yeah,
amazing.
perfect.
My all-time favorite movie is Big Trouble in Little China.
Dude, I haven't seen that movie.
Oh my gosh, how can you sleep at night? You've never seen it.
I haven't seen it, and it's like one of the biggest cult classic movies ever.
Oh
Shame
yeah,
on me.
great one-liners. Kurt Russell does an amazing part. Some of the practical stuff they do in that movie is great, and I can't
Mhm.
imagine what it was like trying to do any visual effects work on that back in that era.
I'm also interested in how they did visual effects back in the 90s and early 2000s with what limited computer power they had. We actually did an episode about Lost in Space, the 1998 movie remake. Did you ever see that?
I want to say I did, but I can't picture anything from it. If I did watch it, it was probably like bits and pieces here and there on TV.
Yeah, it had the actor from Friends who played Joey. Anyway, so we did an episode about that, and in the research for that episode, I watched a lot of behind-the-scenes documentary footage about from the visual effects artist or maybe the director for that, maybe the creative director. I'm not sure what his title is, but he was talking about the limitations they had. They said, we can't do soft lighting in computer graphics because it just takes too much number crunching. He's like, we can only have like one or two light sources in each scene. And I'm like, oh man, that must have been rough.
Oh, good God. Yeah, I can't
Uh,
imagine that.
but they made it work, like you were saying earlier, problem solving and finding creative ways to make things look realistic and fool the eye. They did a pretty good job for that for that year. And I have a love hate relationship with that movie. And the love side is the practical effects and the visual effects that they did in that movie, were just really fun and really really interesting to watch and wonder how they did it. All right, any other movies you worked on your list?
I worked on another movie. It was called Homefront with Jason Statham in it. I didn't do a whole lot of work on this movie because it was going on as I was working on Iceman. But as we finished up Iceman, I tacked on to work on a couple of shots with Homefront. Nothing really too much that I even remember except for two scenes in particular. And I've never even seen this movie yet. I own it on DVD. Still haven't watched it. One scene was a gentleman with I believe it was an alligator tattoo on his arm, and it was obviously fake when you see the raw footage. It looked like somebody watercolored it on there. So I kind of had to desaturate it, make it look smoothed out like it was kind of an older faded out tattoo. And the other scene, a little more exciting, it was at nighttime with harsh lighting, and Jason Statham is basically taking somebody to the ground, and they had a knife, and the fake blade on the knife was covered in green tape. That way you can, uh, like with green screen removal, pretty much when they
Mhm.
have it green or blue. This one was taped on there green, so you can extract that, and then I had to model a blade to stick in there, and
And why was that? Why were you replacing the blade?
not because there wasn't a real blade at all. It was just taped green. So when in the movie you want to make the real stabbing motion, make it look convincing.
Oh,
And if you got a real
he was
blade
just
on
holding
there,
the hilt.
exactly. So he just
So he
holding
was
on
just
to
holding the
blade.
hilt of the handle.
So if he would have, done that realistically with a blade, that would have been obviously calling 911 and have to find a new actor. So our job was to make the
Yeah.
blade look real, and it had to track it. It's one thing a lot of people don't
Ooh.
understand about doing visual effects. It's not just creating one image and putting it in there and saying, "Oh, my job is done. It looks real." Well, as the camera moves and people move and objects move, you have to literally take this object you've created and rendered and even lit to look realistic. And as anything at all moves in that scene, your object has to move with it and be very convincing. If anything moves
Yeah.
up, down, left, right, and it's not the same path as it would in real life, it's a dead giveaway. And we call this tracking.
Oh man, yeah. What I do with my compositing is a cinch compared to video compositing. because you've got that third dimension to worry about. You've got motion blur. There's objects coming in front or behind. It's like, oh my goodness, I can't imagine how a lot of these scenes are done. It's so much work.
Oh yeah,
And
whole new ball game.
a knife blade, that's a lot of like jittery motion, tracking in 3D just aspects going on. Ooh, I won't even know where to start with that. I tried to do a lightsaber fight where I was tracking the hilt and the end of a blade and replacing with the glowing blade in After Effects. And the motion tracking feature in After Effects was not doing the job. It just wasn't following it right. So I basically had to do it by hand every frame. And boy, did that get old. But that wasn't really truly 3D tracking. A lot of work involved. You mentioned these movies that you've worked on. What are some of the most difficult scenes that you've done in those?
Well, the one that stands out to this day as the most difficult one I've worked on, and I say difficult because such minute details, it was nitpicked probably more than any other shot I've worked on by our supervisors, and just the time it took. I believe you've already mentioned you haven't seen the movie. It was on Texas Chainsaw 3D. So there's a scene where this girl is running from Leatherface. She comes up to a carnival, and of course, you're in a carnival. There's all kinds of things going on. There's people dressed up. And at first, this guy running around with a chainsaw with a girl, you can think it's just some part of the act in the carnival. Her way to escape is she runs up to the Ferris wheel, and she ends up trying to climb the Ferris wheel, ends up grabbing on one of the carts. So
Never
she
do
grabs
that.
onto one of the carts. It starts lifting her up in the air. And while this is going on, I don't remember exactly how many shots were in this sequence, but every few seconds, the angle would change as it moves. And
Yeah.
so when they
It
did
wasn't a
this,
stationary camera.
exactly. So when they did this, they had a belt wrapped around her, and they had two wires that were holding her onto these carts. And
Hmm.
we have to remove that in post, which by itself can be very difficult as they're moving around. She's holding onto the cart, her arms are moving, her legs are swinging, the cart's swinging. But to make this even more difficult, she had a black and white striped shirt on.
Oh no.
Anybody who's familiar with Photoshop, if you just got an all one color surface and you need to remove a piece of dust or something on it, it's fairly easy to cover it up. But if you got checkerboards, any kind of pattern, anything like that, you just made it harder by tenfold. We had to remove the belt, move the wires, and as I mentioned, she's swinging this whole time. So there's a lot of lights in the scene coming off the Ferris wheel, coming off the carnival, and whatever, lights they used on set for the scene. So
It's
as the
shadows, right?
exactly. So as the cart swings, there's shadows going left and right. There's specular highlights on that cart. There's patterns on the cart, and it was almost frame by frame. I'm having to go and use the patches I created and move them into place. So what we call tracking by hand tracking, to put these in place because there's no tracker, 2D, 3D, anything you can use that would take care of all these aspects. All said and done, it was very draining physically from being there for so many hours. I worked many, many days over 12 hours on that. It was
Oh my gosh.
physically
It's not good
draining.
for your eyes.
Yeah, it was mentally draining. And I think for when you see the movie, you can tell people, okay, like, hold on, here comes my shot, here comes my shot. And you're like, all right, there it is. And boom, it disappears. So maybe a second and a half, 2 seconds of real time. And for me to accomplish this shot, I worked over 110 hours on it.
No way.
Yeah, so at that time I was working on that movie. I don't remember what my pay rate was, but you take that times
wasn't
110
enough.
plus whatever overtime I was hitting, and that's maybe 2 seconds.
Do you get paid hourly for this kind of work?
Yes, it's hourly.
Okay, that's better, but still. I cannot imagine how tedious wire removal must be in movies. One of my favorite movies of all time is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. The wire work in that movie is spectacular, and it just lends the whole movie to this beautiful kung fu martial art fantasy feel where there's almost magic at work when they're jumping and running alongside of these walls with no gravity. It's just like amazing to watch. And they, of course, hired a company to remove all the wires. And I'm thinking, holy smokes, how did they do that? Like in Photoshop, you've got clone, which you can copy from one area and paint onto another area. That's one trick to remove, pimples and hairs and things like that, or trash on the ground. And then there's heal, which is like you paint over an object and it kind of algorithmically decides what is around that spot, and it kind of makes its own little patch, right? It's like a smart tool where it just kind of comes up with a pattern or a color, and you can heal. You can get rid of pimples and hairs and things like that way. But with video, I mean, are they using similar tools, or how does that work?
It's very, very similar. Um, so you mentioned the clone tool. We have a clone tool in Nuke that we would use, and we
Yeah.
also have a tool called Transform Masked. Now in Photoshop, I believe this is called the patch tool, where you can, let's say,
Yeah.
draw a circle around something, then you
Yeah.
drag that selection over to a side, and then it kind of uses that information to cover up your original spot.
Mm-hmm. Samples from it. Yeah.
Exactly. So if you use the clone tool, um, you can say use it for one frame. Let's say if you have a speck of dust pop up in one frame, you can go in there and
Yeah.
clone that out and leave it be. But for the wires, if the wire swings through the whole shot for 1,000 frames, that clone stamp is, it's got to follow that wire. So that's when you
Right.
kind of run into problems going frame by frame trying to do it. And this is where the transform mask comes into play. So you take your area you'd like to move, you make your, and it's called selection in Photoshop, or you can use your pin tool to select things. It's called
Mm-hmm.
rotoscoping in Nuke when you basically make your cutout selections. So you'll get
Yeah.
your roto node and you'll make the selection around what you want. Then you'll attach that to the transform mask node, and then you can slide that
Wow.
over to the area you want to patch. But then, when, like I mentioned before, how difficult tracking can be, now this node where you made your roto shape and you moved it to make your patch, you now have to track this shape along with what you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to cover through X amount of frames. This can be a problem because what you cover in one frame and move, let's say, an inch to the right to patch, well, as the camera moves, that spot you used to patch is something completely different now.
Yeah, a
So
different perspective too, and
exactly. So if you're
it's
patching
moving
something
in a
out in
3D
a dark
space.
sky, it may work for a few frames. But now if the
Yeah.
camera is moved in front of a building, you can't fill that space in with a building. So you have to go tell your transform mask to stop at this point, start a new node, redraw another shape, find a new place to patch it, track it back in, and then decide how many frames this is going to work, and so forth. So you can spend all day removing one wire with one node over the point of only 30, 40 frames and hope that it plays back and looks realistic.
And there's no jumps or artifacts or anything weird that shows up. Yeah,
Exactly.
very interesting. All right, what are some other difficult projects or scenes you've created or help make?
And Olympus Has Fallen, for those who've seen the movie, the scene where a helicopter takes off from the White House lawn and and then gets blown up basically in the air. I animated that helicopter taking off from the ground, and I used Autodesk Maya to put this 3D model into the scene. So basically, we take our footage, put it into the background of this program, then we load into it the model that we're using, and then we have
Mm-hmm.
to scale it to the proper position to where it fits in the scene,
Yeah.
and then I have to animate it taking off. And I had never really done any animation up to this point, and I felt like I could do it, and other people felt like I could do it because it was, not what we call organic. Organic stuff to animate, like people, animals, things like that, is very hard to animate
Yeah.
because there's so many fluid movements. But a
Mm-hmm.
helicopter, I basically turned on YouTube, found the exact helicopter, and watched about 6 hours of how these things take off, how they move, how they shake and rock, and all this
Nice.
stuff. And about a day and a half of working on it, I got it to where it looks pretty good. But then we had to composite it, match the color and the specular highlights, the
Yeah.
depth maps, the ambient occlusion maps, all this to make it fit in the scene and look real itself. And not
Mm-hmm.
only that, there's other parts where you have to put in police vehicles, flashing lights. As it took off from the ground in the original scene, there was the front part of a real helicopter. There was no tail, no blades, anything, just the front cabin. So as you take the helicopter and animate it, you then had to go in and do cleanup work and remove the original helicopter and re-put in the shadow on the ground that you covered up. So it turns into a lot of work, but at the end of the day, it worked out, and I'm glad I got to make the movie.
Hopefully, the listener is grasping the amount of work and skill that goes into creating these fantastical scenes, or sometimes disgustingly gruesome scenes. It's a lot of
Exactly.
work. It's not for the faint of heart or the people with no work ethic. So what are some, aside from the movies that you've worked on, what are some, other like Hollywood movies that you're fans of that have visual effects scenes that just really stick out to you? Like what are some of your favorite VFX scenes in movies?
It's not really a particular scene I can think of, but I remember just
Mhm.
seeing the trailer for the Pacific Rim movie when that came out a few years
Oh,
ago,
beautiful.
and I was just blown away because at this point in time, I was at the end of my career in visual effects, and I'd done a lot of compositing, so I understood that very well. But I was
Hmm.
transitioning into the 3D modeling and texturing, the lighting and rendering and all that. So when I see something that is heavily 3D and looks very realistic, I know firsthand how difficult that was. And
Hmm.
that's what really,
Totally.
really blows me away. And I feel like Pacific Rim was done on a phenomenal level. Now, the movie itself and dialogue is some of the worst I've ever come across, but
Yeah.
the visual effects and 3D work is top notch, absolutely stunning.
Yeah, the photorealism is really high in those scenes with the mechs and the city scenes and the water. There's also a lot of simulation going on of water particles and in atmosphere and things like that. Very impressive. I also love how the movement of the robots is very believable. Like there's weight and there's mass and there's momentum involved, you know? There's shaking and there's physics involved with just walking.
Oh
That
yeah, yeah.
bad CGI does not take into consideration those aspects of reality.
Correct.
But
When I started doing 3D work, I mean, not just necessarily what I did, but just the overall broad aspect. There's people who can do so much in the 3D work, but you can get hired as a 3D artist and only make smoke or only make
yeah,
rocks, only make rain. Like if you're a specialist and that's what you do, you can be hired for the rest of your life
nice.
doing this.
I'm a professional rain man.
Exactly, and in
I do vomit only.
in Maya, a lot of what they use for many different things is what they refer to as fluid particles. So you can
Yeah.
do rain or water effects, but a lot of really convincing fire, which I think
Hmm.
a lot of the fire scenes in Texas Chainsaw 3D, if I remember correctly, are made using the fluid particles generators. And
Yeah.
when you have these people who dial in the right real world attributes, like you mentioned, physics, and of course a little bit of coding knows how to help to
Hmm.
type in there to get what you
Oh
want,
yeah.
but it all simulates that, and it can be very convincing.
I first got into 3D with Maxon Cinema 4D, and this was when it was like version 6, I think, version 7 maybe. And this was probably like 2003-ish, 2002, somewhere around there. I think I was in junior high. And I remember when the fluid simulation product came out, and it was like, whoa, like that looks like a tidal wave gushing down a hallway, like there was physics involved. There's actual programmed physics with gravity and momentum and fluid viscosity. All these like scientific things are being brought into the visual realm. And that just blew my mind. I couldn't get over how amazing that was when it first came out because it was new, and movies didn't quite have very convincing liquid animation scenes because with 3D they'd have to do practical effects when there's water involved, or fire or smoke. But yeah, around that time, around 2005 ish, I feel like is when fluid simulation really went to new levels. And nowadays it's just insane. You see these water and mist and this crazy stuff. It's very impressive. And the average viewer has no idea, how
Oh
much went
yeah,
into
yeah,
this.
no clue in the world.
They don't know that one single frame of that video just took like 3 days to render because there's so much water and reflection and you name it.
Yeah.
There's a single frame in Frozen. It's when Elsa is making her ice castle, and I think it's when she's like it's near the end of the scene where the castle is developed around her and there's like a lot of shiny reflective rainbow colors happening. It took oh shoot, it's in a previous episode I mentioned, probably in the best VFX and cinema episode we did, but it took like 3 days to render one frame. I forgot. There's maybe 100 hours, something like that. It's insane, and that was just for one of the frames. Like all the other frames around that time had to have also taken equally long, if a little bit shorter. But wow, they're using some serious computing power. Oh, speaking of rendering and render times, here's a funny little tidbit I came across in the news. The new Kingdom Hearts 3 video game came out recently, It's all the rage because boom, boom, like 12 years for the sequel video game. Well, there's a cutscene in the video game, which is an animated scene you just watch, you don't play. And in one single frame, there's a watermark logo that they didn't catch. Because apparently, when they render these scenes, they're not using one computer. They're using a whole render farm, which is like a network of computers to render different frames at different times or to do different parts of a single frame, right? So apparently, one of these computers licenses for the rendering engine that they used for the program. The license on one of these computers expired. And what happens when you don't have a license? You have a watermark over your frame. And so one frame has has a watermark on it, but all the other frames are good. But yeah, pretty funny.
And that's kind of funny. We had a render farm downstairs below our studio that had about 60 servers in it, and
Wow.
we had a script on the computers upstairs we use at the end of every day. You would hit this script and it would run as were done with your computer, which would turn your machine into a render machine also to connect. And yeah, we'd have some movies where some frames you'd hit render and come back next day and just hoping that it worked out.
So these servers have like really high-end graphics cards in them, or what are they doing?
I'm not 100% sure on the tech behind it, but I know there was so much power running through them, and we had to put them in a
Lot of heat.
separate room with a separate AC unit just to keep the room cool enough the way they didn't overheat.
Oh yeah. What are some other movies that have some great VFX scenes that stand out to you, or just like you said, movies in general that really wowed you?
Definitely Jurassic Park. Just as a
Oh
kid,
yeah.
seeing that, the very first scene I believe of the dinosaurs, where um, the archaeologist is on the jeep and
Hmm.
you see him kind of just look over to the side and take his sunglasses off and have to stand up.
Great cinematography technique there too.
Exactly, and I think it was either a Brontosaurus or the Brachiosaurus, that were walking there, a
Hmm.
whole bunch of them. That was pretty stunning, and of course, I'm sure most of us have seen Jurassic Park and just how convincing it can be
Hopefully.
that some of those dinosaurs are real.
It's aged well. I saw it a few years ago. I was still like, oh, it holds up, I'm not looking at like, oh, that's so 90s, but it's still good.
Oh yeah, even the scene to where right after they use the goat as bait, and the T Rex finds out the fences aren't on and snaps through it and comes
Hmm.
out and roars at
Yeah.
everything. That's still an amazing shot today.
I have found that in the past, I've had trouble watching movies like this because of the fact that I know how this stuff is done, or at least a general idea of how these scenes are created. So I have a really hard time just watching them as a movie. Do you suffer the same problem?
I do in varying degrees. Um,
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be distracting because if it's a real pivotal moment in the movie and you want to lock yourself
Hmm.
in there and make yourself feel like you're a part of it, it can be
Yeah.
kind of distracting because I'll be sitting there going, wow, I wonder how they did that. And I may miss some important dialogue or something like that. But usually what makes it difficult is when it's done poorly, I sit there and think, my God, I could have done a better job at that. Or, I wonder
I've
what
thought
their
that
budget
too.
was because they could have paid a little bit
Yeah.
extra to make that look real. And
Uh-huh.
and B, when I'm around a group of friends and I just kind of can't help it. I have to kind of say how it was done, bring it up, say, X happened
Hmm.
or Y happened, and they're kind of just turn and look at me. And at first they're like, "Oh wow, that's cool," but they've heard me do this so long now that it's kind of like, okay, really, let me watch the
Like,
movie. Come on.
Ryan, stop tearing apart the scene.
Exactly. So
Stop
can't you
deconstructing.
just let me enjoy it for what it is?
Yeah, the whole purpose of visual effects is to saturate the senses and engage someone into a fantasy scene or a fictional item. I've gotten better in recent years. I think in the middle school and high school years when I was really grasping how it's all done, I was kind of learning about the magic. I was learning behind the curtain with how the stuff is done. At that time, it was really hard for me to enjoy any scene that involved anything visual effects or even practical effects because I'd be wanting to tear it apart, deconstruct it. But I've gotten better.
It happens to me a lot when I'm watching 3D movies. For
Yeah.
example, like I want to say just about every Marvel movie you've seen that's in 3D is not shot in real 3D. Uh, it's basically just a trick of the eye. So you'll take your shot and you'll roto out your different objects, and then you'll take that roto shape you created of it, and you'll move that in X and Y and Z space to kind of simulate what that second camera is seeing. But because that
Hmm.
second camera is not really there, it just doesn't seem right to me. Now, if you never worked on the movies, it might just go right by you, might not even notice. But it really stands out to me. And when you do a stereoscopic movie that's filmed that way, but when you get it onto the computer, if you don't do the transition of working on the left and right eye the correct manner,
Mm.
it can really throw it off and look blurry. The objects just don't flow
Mm.
correctly. And the last one where I really noticed this was um, my fiance is a real big Disney fan. So when Beauty and the Beast came out, I took her to see
Yeah.
it. I bought her, real good seats for the IMAX showing. And I don't remember exactly what part of the movie. It might have been the first time I think Belle's her name walks into the big mansion and you can
Mm.
see the fireplace off in the background and immediately it's like somebody shone a red spotlight on the fireplace because it was the stereoscopy was just off so much
Weird.
I could not stop staring at it for that entire duration of that scene.
So this whole realm of CGI and visual effects is progressing exponential. I mean, Avatar was 2009, and that was great. And now, we just had Battle Angel Alita come out. There's just incredible visual effects we're seeing in all kinds of movies. Where do you see the future of computer generated imagery and visual effects going in the Hollywood realm?
Yeah, well, it's funny you bring up Avatar. I agree with that wholeheartedly. A good friend of mine works for the company who did Avatar, and he worked on that movie, and is still
Uh,
out there in New Zealand working on those films. But
yeah.
for the future, I've seen a couple of clips of some of this work that's done over the past couple of years, and I'm not sure exactly what they refer to it as, but it's like 3D facial tracking, like facial recognition. Like you've
Hmm.
mentioned with the Ninja Turtles, they have the animatronics and you have to move the lips and talk. Well, I'm sure you can see it in like video games where they put the suits on people with all the balls on them and can track their movements. Uh,
Hmm.
I think we're getting to the point to where we can do that with faces and emotions and lips and speech. Uh,
Yeah.
so now,
Lips, man. Lips have been the hardest thing, I think, in the 3D world, face animation.
oh yeah, yeah, just lips, any
Don't
facial
look right.
interactions in general, just to make it look sincere. And
Yeah.
I've seen them experimenting with this already, and I think it's going to get to the point to where you have your voice actor in a movie, you'll just be able to, record his face, and as he's
Yeah.
giving you that voice on the microphone, basically audio acting, it's going to
Yeah.
record all that and just transfer it over to the character.
That's how they shot Battle Angel Alita. I don't recall if she had the dots on her face. Probably did, but I mean, she was acting. She was doing the voice part too, and the end result is really impressive.
Oh yeah, because the animation has been pretty good for a long time now, as far as movements,
Yeah,
hand gestures,
sure.
running, jumping. We're pretty spot on, and it's hard to really pinpoint a movie that's come out in the past 10 years and point out bad animation. But like you mentioned, it's always the emotional side.
Yeah.
The lips, the cheeks, how they move, um,
Mm-hmm.
the eyebrows, how they crunch when people have different emotions.
Mm-hmm.
That and we're getting to this point where we can nail that.
Yeah. Avatar again was foundational in that with the facial camera that James Cameron and his team developed. Now, this is interesting. I also mentioned 1998's remake of Lost in Space. They used this same technology to record the villain. At the end of the movie, he's basically the spider creature hybrid, and it's totally CGI. So Gary Oldman was acting these scenes, and they were recording his voice, but they're also recording his facial movements, and they translated that into the 3D model. I'm like, this is 1998. And, I remember when Avatar came out, everyone's like, oh, this has never been done before. I'm like, well, I don't know about that. But he definitely perfected it, and it's miles ahead of 98, of course. But very cool technology with tracking the face. I think they use UV cameras and UV lights to really pinpoint those dots on their face moving around. Pretty
Wow. See,
awesome
I didn't know
technology.
they were that good at that, going that far back. I just remember seeing it towards the end of my
Yeah,
visual effects
there's.
career, kind of like the next latest, greatest, I guess, version of it. And this
Mhm.
was probably 2014, 2015. So yeah, in the next 5 years, the current standards, I'm sure they're blowing it out of the water now.
Pretty soon they won't need any fancy cameras. They'll just have, high def enough cameras with algorithms to just follow their skin pores.
Oh yeah, and some of the modeling and texturing is getting so photorealistic.
Yeah.
certain scenes in movies. It's hard to tell where the real character is before the animated one comes in, before some explosion or
Hmm.
somebody takes off flying or something like that. It's thrown through a wall.
Infinity War had some amazing character replacements. I mean, obviously Thanos was so well done,
Hmm.
and also one of his cronies, the woman alien character that was fighting Black Widow, and some of the other characters. I forgot the character's name, but she was really tall, and she was really well done. I was just like the detail and the motion was just wow.
Oh, yeah. It's mind blowing, and even
Mhm.
now, knowing how most of it's done, I'm still just in awe at seeing some of
Yeah.
these newer films.
So that leads me to one of my questions. I've seen a lot of behind the scenes footage and the before afters, like you said, the VFX breakdown videos, which I'm kind of addicted to. I found an Instagram account that just does VFX breakdown videos. I could just watch those all day long because they're
Yeah,
just so interesting and they're all
that's awesome.
different. But I've noticed something in these where there will be a character, an actor with a blue suit on, that's going to be erased and or overlaid with a CGI character of some kind, and they're acting, the camera's moving, or they're in a car that's moving, and their face or their hand will cover something up. But later in the final version, they've put in the CGI character, but their hand was covering up something, or their face was covering up something in the background that was digitally re-added. I guess they're using similar techniques to what we said earlier with the cloning and the transform masking. But can you give any other insight into how background plates are, I mean, painted to look realistic in perspective when it was literally covered up before?
Sometimes you'll have green screens or blue screens, and you'll still have something practical in front of it. So you only need to
Hmm.
move the green screen portion and just slap in whatever background you've created. Or they'll, like, for example, the scene I talked about with the home front with the green knife blade. Now, instead of just
Yeah,
having a hilt with no knife blade at all, they put the green blade in there so you can use that to help track and simulate. And the
right.
new blade you put in just straight ahead and went and covered it up. So that's
Yeah, but
um
I'm talking about scenes where there was physically something real, like the person's head or the person's hand, which had, blue latex over it, that it was actually covering up what would be pixels that weren't there. So it's like they're creating something that wasn't there before, and it just looks totally fluid.
well, a lot of
How do they
times
do that stuff?
that's when your professional 3D modeler and texture comes in
Yeah.
and puts
Huh.
something in there, and you can never tell the difference. Um,
Yeah.
well, I've done a
Just
lot of green
blended in so
screens to
well.
where I'll put a background replacement on something, and it completely covers up, most of the whole shot. And then I'll
Mm.
go back in and use rotoscoping to bring back certain aspects to show. But if you're cutting out somebody's limb, uh, like I mentioned before, it's when somebody comes in and a modeler, somebody more advanced than what I was, and you basically just have to build it piece by piece and throw it back
Wow.
in front of whatever is being hidden.
Yeah. And I can spend easily 30 minutes masking a person's body to cut them out of a background or to put something behind them like fog or whatever. And I'm zooming in doing pixel by pixel sometimes,
Hmm.
getting in those crevices and those corners. Um, how does video software handle that?
I was just about to say, try doing that for 600 frames in a row.
I quit. No
So when
thank
it
you.
comes to a person, that's when, or anything organic that's moving, that's when green
Hmm.
screen and blue screen really comes in handy, because you can extract that background. Now,
Hmm.
if you got somebody running, a quarter mile while you're filming, chances are you don't have a quarter mile long green screen. So that's when like you would do masking using the pen tool to cut out in Photoshop. We would use the roto paint node and have to go in and roto them out. And that was one of my big things that I really disliked about Photoshop when I started learning it for photography, because I would say,
Hmm.
man, if this was a film and if I was using Nuke, I would know exactly what to do here. But in Photoshop,
Hmm.
I didn't know what the heck the tool was called. I didn't know
Hmm.
how to do the different iterations of the tool. So I had the idea. My brain was telling me, this is what needs to be done. I just needed to know where in Photoshop to find it to do it.
What is it called in this program?
Exactly. And where do I
You need
find
you
it on
need a
this
Rosetta
bar to the
Stone.
left?
You need a
So
Rosetta Stone class to translate Photoshop for you.
exactly. So that was my biggest curve. It's like I know how to do this. I just don't know where to find it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so you'll roto paint somebody out, but in this nuke program, every single point you add, like if you added a point in your pen tool, you could select that individual point and feather it, uh, just like the term in Photoshop is used feather to help blend it, but you can pull the feathering
Hmm.
outside or inside. So instead of an overall feathering around your subject to help blend it, you can control each little point you picked around there and control the feathering that way. And this helped blend stuff so much more phenomenally easy than you can in Photoshop. And so when you're doing frame by frame, you may come across a brick wall in one portion, or you may have a car that's partially blurred out going behind the person. So you have a different, what I like to call give, to where you can help sell it. If you got motion blur in front of a still object, it's going to be pretty obvious you have a still object back there. But if you got a
Hmm.
running character with motion blur who's running next to a car that has motion blur, you have a little bit more leeway to cut that person out. Um, but if you have green screen, anything with motion blur, there's a little bit of green showing through that motion blur, and although it's easier to cut that person out, it's harder to fix that blending and remove that what we call green spill and these little bit of different aspects there. And in some movies, they'll hire an entire team of just roto paint artists, and we'll call it the roto team, and their entire job is to go through every scene. And if anybody ever decides that this needs to be rotoed, this person needs to be rotoed, whatever, they'll spend just hours and hours and hours doing all
Ugh,
that. So you get your shot,
so
you got to
tedious.
composite the background, do the green screen, and they'll say, "Here's your roto, done by the team," and just knock that part out for you.
I'm going to make a future prediction. This is a tradition I have in this podcast. My future prediction is that eventually AI will take care of that. What do you think?
Um, they're working on it. We use what we call interpolation for that already. So let's just say you had a ball on the left side of the screen and it moved just on the x-axis to the right
Mhm.
side of the screen. You can go to the first frame, draw your circular roto paint node around it,
Yeah.
go to the very last frame, draw it around it, and now as your shot plays back, it'll try to interpolate the frames in between, and that roto node will try to guess and follow. So you can
Yeah,
go
After Effects has that. I think it's called like auto rotoscope or something like that, and it'll track like your face or an outline of a body.
exactly.
Pretty
I've
cool.
I've heard about that in After Effects, and I've heard it works
Hmm.
fairly well in After Effects too. Um,
Yeah, if you got green screen, it's way better. If you don't, it's a little tricky.
exactly, but it just comes down to the point though, to where if you got a person or a tree, something with arms that bends and joints that doesn't all
Yeah,
move the same direction, that's when you're just sometimes forced to go in there frame by frame and move all your points, and
yeah.
there's no getting around it. I had to I
Interesting.
had to do a shot for the big wedding with Robert De Niro. Um, he's laying on the floor, and Susan Sarandon is standing over him. And at this point in time, I'll describe it just a little bit, and you can get an idea what was going on. But in the frame, it's him laying on the floor, kind of looking up. You can see Susan Sarandon's legs, and she, I think, bends down to grab her underwear and pull it back up under her dress. But they were filmed in two completely different scenes. So I had to roto her out, her dress, every piece of fabric as it moved, her underwear, her arms, everything going down to grab it, move her in front of Robert De Niro in the second scene as if she were really standing there. And
Weird.
I had to basically recreate all the cupboards in the back, the floorboard, part of the refrigerator, from another scene and track it in to where it looks still. And I think this shot's on my demo reel. Um, but there was a lot
Yeah,
of
I saw
roto
that.
done in that.
I was trying to understand what was happening. I watched it a few times and I was like, wait, I don't understand.
Yeah, I
I
didn't do
guess
the
that's how
best
good of a
job
job
at
he did.
editing that.
I
I'm
couldn't
not
tell.
so much of a video editor. I was more specifically a visual effects artist. So if I had to
No,
go and
you did
re-edit it
fine.
now, I'd probably do a
You
better
did
job.
fine. I just couldn't tell what was real or not.
Exactly. So that was really her in the both scrubs, the
Yeah.
left and right scrub I did of it. But I had to take her from one of those shots, move her over into the other one, and they call it a split screen shot. And I had to do that in one day. They basically came out and said, "This is what we needed. How many hours do you need to do this? We'd like it done by the end of the day." So I basically had an 8 hour time frame and
Wow.
was running around, like a chicken with its head cut off, and got it
Yeah.
done.
Crazy. All right. Well, I got one question left for you. It is this. What happens to all of the digital files and 3D files and animation files that are created in these movie projects? Like, where do they all go afterwards? Do they just get locked in a vault somewhere, or do they get deleted? What? There's a lot of data.
Wow, that's a good question, and I never thought about asking that when I was
Like,
working there.
I'm thinking of like really big ones, like Lord of the Rings. Like, the scenes they made with Massive and the crowds and the 3D props. Like, where's all that stuff go? Where is it? Is it somewhere? Can I get access to it?
Wow, I have no idea. I know we worked above what we called a prop house, where we would build a lot of props, and we would
Hmm.
use it for some filming. We would do some practical stuff outside, blowing up some charges. There's a scene in Olympus Has Fallen where we're working and you hear explosions outside, and it turns out like there have charges in the ground as a guy's running through to simulate like airplane fire hitting the ground as he's running by. Um,
Hmm.
but I think when the props are done, like they're done. If you don't need it, they send that out. We had a lot of
Yeah.
vehicles that were filmed in the movies sitting out in the parking lot for a long time. When it comes to the files, the 3D models and all that stuff, I'm assuming it's just backed up on a hard drive somewhere for at least X amount of years before,
Yeah. In
if at all,
case
it's
there's a
destroyed.
special edition or something. Like
Hmm.
Star Wars.
So I know I kept all
Interesting.
my own stuff that I could get my hands on, but I have discs of you can put in requests at the end of the movie, say, hey, I worked on this shot, this shot, this shot,
Oh, cool.
and they'll send you a disc with the before and the after on it. And I still
Nice.
have those discs somewhere here in my house.
That's cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for um, breaking open the lid on this mystery of movie magic. I really appreciate it. It's been a really fun episode, I think.
Oh, no problem. I can go off about this and photography, pretty much anything art related if I have some knowledge on it all day long.
I I totally feel you there. I'm the same way. For those of you listening out there, you gotta find Ryan's work. You can just Google him, type in Ryan L Imagery, and you'll find his stuff online. It's great. It's unfortunate you're not doing visual effects anymore, but you know what? Photography is just a heck of a lot easier. And I'm glad you're doing something you love. That's what matters.
I love it. It is easier to some point. It is just more fulfilling getting out,
Yeah.
interacting with people face to face,
Oh yeah.
seeing their
Yeah. Not
emotions
sitting
of
at a
them and their
computer,
families.
not
So
painting someone's shirt back in for 3,000 frames.
exactly. I don't have to make Sylvester Stallone look 20 years younger at all anymore.
No one could pay me enough to do that job.
Exactly. No more staring at Ronda Rousey's face for 16
Oh.
hours as she walks in front of a green screen with blonde hair flying everywhere and lights flashing off. I'm done with all that.
All right. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Definitely find the post on Facebook, comment, let us know what you thought, and let us know what your favorite VFX scenes are or practical effects in any movie or TV show. We'd love to hear back from you guys. We may even do another episode on visual effects. You can find our previous episodes. We did one called Best VFX in Cinema and another one called Worst VFX in Cinema, which was really fun. We got to look at scenes where we just kind of wonder, how did this get through the cutting room floor? How did this make it to the big screen? And that was a pretty great one. Okay, well, that's it for this show. Thank you guys for listening and have a great week. If you like this show, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can also find our previous episodes there and listen whenever you want. We love to hear from our listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future episodes, you can reach us at tvvpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a great week. There's so much blood squirting, it's kind of crazy.
I love that. I love the anime movies, some of the foreign films where they do that and limbs get cut off and it's like somebody turned on the fire hose. So.
Yeah. It's like, how much ounces of blood can a human body carry? Sheesh.
Yeah, exactly. Like somebody's losing a lot of blood and they're still running around when they should be passed out.
He just lost 36 quarts of blood.
Yeah, you can go outside and water the plants or something.